She stepped off at the wrong station, but found the family she never expected. The sun beat down fierce over the New Mexico plains, its heat pressing against the earth until even the stones seemed to breathe fire. The train slowed with a long, aching whistle, steam hissing as the wheels ground against the tracks. Dust rose in lazy clouds around the wooden platform, and Eleanor Hart stepped carefully down from the carriage, her gloved hand gripping the handle of her suitcase. Her boots, polished neat that morning, gathered dust the moment they touched the boards. She paused, blinking against the glare, her heart thudding. She had expected a crowd, perhaps even a carriage waiting with her name called clear. But there was no bustle here, no rows of shops or clattering wagons, only a weathered station with paint peeling from its sign. Dust Creek, it read, though her letter had promised Creekstone. She frowned, reaching into her satchel to draw out the worn envelope, its paper soft with handling. The ink had blurred in places where rain had touched it, the town's name smudged into something she had squinted over more than once. She looked around again, her throat tightening. Surely this could not be the right place. The platform held only a handful of folk. A freight man unloading crates, 2 ranch hands passing a bottle, and a small girl with hair the color of wheat who stood staring at Eleanor as if she were some vision. Before Eleanor could gather her bearings, the child ran forward, her little shoes pounding against the planks, and threw herself against Eleanor's skirt. Her arms clutched tight around her waist, face buried in the folds of cloth. Eleanor staggered back a step, startled by the sudden weight. "Mama," the girl whispered. Her voice cracked with tears and hope. "God finally answered me." Eleanor froze, the words striking her chest with strange force. She placed a tentative hand on the girl's head, fingers brushing soft curls, not knowing what to say. The child held her tighter, as though she might vanish if she tried to step away. A man's voice called out sharp across the platform. "Clara!" Eleanor lifted her eyes and saw him. He was tall, broad at the shoulders, his shirt faded by sun and years of labor, his boots coated in the red dust of the land. His face was strong, marked by lines that spoke of hard seasons and harder nights. He moved fast, then slowed when he drew near, his gaze settling first on the girl, then on Eleanor. "I am sorry, ma'am," he said, his voice low, rough as gravel yet careful. He knelt to pry the girl loose, though she resisted, clinging tighter still. "She gets confused sometimes." The girl looked up at him, her cheeks streaked with dust and tears. "She looks like Mama." The man's jaw tightened. He stood again, towering above them both, his hat in hand. "I am Samuel Reed," he said, offering a nod. "And this is my daughter." Eleanor swallowed, her own name slipping from her lips with hesitation. "Eleanor Hart. I think I may have gotten off at the wrong station." Samuel glanced toward the letter still clutched in her hand, his brow furrowing. "If you were bound for Creekstone, ma'am, then you are nowhere close. This here is Dust Creek. You may be stuck for a while. Trains do not stop often out here." And in then of Refus, the weight of his words pressed against her as heavy as the sun overhead. The train hissed once more, then rolled away into the horizon, leaving her with her suitcase, her confusion, and the arms of a child who refused to let go. The sun was sinking low by the time Eleanor followed Samuel and his daughter down the dirt road that stretched from the station toward the horizon. The air was thick with the smell of dust and dry sage, and her skirts caught burrs and grit as she walked. Samuel carried her suitcase without complaint, though he said little, his long stride steady, his face unreadable. The little girl, Clara, skipped along between them, holding Eleanor's hand as if she had known her all her life. Every few steps she glanced up and smiled, her curls bouncing in the fading light, and Eleanor felt her heart ache in a way she could not explain. The ranch came into view at the edge of the prairie, a plain house of weathered boards patched in places, with a small barn that leaned slightly to the left. A well stood nearby, its rope frayed but sturdy, and a few chickens scratched the earth beneath the fence. It was no grand home, yet something about it seemed honest, worn by hard years but still standing tall. Samuel set her suitcase on the porch, then pushed open the door and held it for her. Inside, the air smelled of wood smoke and coffee, the walls bare except for a single photograph on the mantel. Eleanor's eyes lingered on it. The image of a young woman with soft eyes, her arm wrapped around a baby who could only be Clara. Samuel noticed her gaze, but said nothing, his jaw tightening slightly before he moved to stoke the fire. Clara tugged Eleanor's hand, guiding her toward a chair near the table. "You can sit here," the child said brightly. "Papa made stew." Eleanor sat carefully, her back straight, hands folded in her lap. She had eaten little since leaving Boston, and the smell of beans and meat simmering in the pot made her stomach twist with longing. Samuel ladled the stew into tin bowls, setting one before her, one before Clara, and one for himself. He did not sit until Clara bowed her head and whispered a quick prayer of thanks. Eleanor followed their lead, her eyes closed though her mind whirled. The first spoonful burned her tongue, but warmed her through. She had not expected it to taste so rich. Samuel ate in silence, his broad hands rough against the small spoon, his eyes never lifting from his bowl. Clara filled the air with chatter, speaking of her chickens, of the rabbit she had seen in the yard that morning, of the doll whose arm needed sewing. Eleanor listened, nodding and smiling faintly, though she could not ignore the way Samuel's gaze sometimes flicked toward her, quick and unreadable. When the meal was finished, Samuel stood and cleared the bowls, rinsing them at the basin with practiced ease. Eleanor rose to help, but he shook his head. "You are our guest," he said quietly. His voice was gruff, but not unkind. Clara yawned then, her head drooping as she leaned against Eleanor's arm. Samuel lifted her easily, carrying her to a small room off the hall. Eleanor followed without thinking, watching as he tucked the girl into bed, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he smoothed the blanket over her. Clara clutched Eleanor's sleeve before drifting off, whispering a soft, "Good night, Mama," in her sleep. Eleanor froze, her throat tightening. Samuel glanced at her, his expression shadowed, but again he said nothing. Later, when she was alone in the small spare room with her suitcase at the foot of the bed, Eleanor sat by the window, staring out at the vast sweep of stars. She had planned to travel to Creekstone, to marry a man she had never met but had agreed to in letters. Instead, she was here in Dust Creek, in the home of a widower and his child who had mistaken her for something she was not. The night air slipped cool through the cracks of the window, and still she sat, her mind restless. She was meant to pass only a night in this place, but as she thought of Clara's small hand in hers and the quiet weight of Samuel's silence, she wondered if fate had set her on a path she had not chosen, yet could not turn away from. Morning broke soft and pale over the prairie, the sun climbing slow and low as if it too was weary from the heat of the day before. Eleanor woke to the sound of chickens scratching outside, and the smell of coffee drifting up through the cracks in the floorboards. For a moment she forgot where she was, her hand brushing against the quilt that covered her, worn thin yet still warm. Then memory returned, the train platform, the little girl who had called her Mama, the widower with the quiet eyes. She dressed quickly, smoothing her skirts, and stepped into the hall where the boards creaked beneath her weight. The house was simple but tidy, the walls bare except for the single photograph she had noticed the night before. She stopped in front of it now, her hand hovering just shy of touching the wooden frame. The woman's face was gentle, her hair swept back in a plain style, her eyes soft as though they had known laughter. In her arms she held a baby swaddled in cloth, the infant's curls already as fair as Clara's. Eleanor felt her breath catch, a sudden pang that had no name. She heard a boot step behind her and turned quickly, startled. Samuel stood in the doorway, his hat in his hands, his expression guarded. "That was Lily," he said quietly, his gaze fixed on the photograph rather than Eleanor, Clara's mother. His voice carried no tremor, yet the weight of the words pressed heavy. Eleanor lowered her eyes, unsure if she ought to speak. "She was beautiful," she said softly. Samuel nodded once, then set his hat on the table. "She died bringing Clara into this world. There was nothing I could do." The silence stretched long after that, filled only by the sound of Clara's laughter drifting in from the yard. Eleanor's heart tightened, aching for a child who would never remember her mother and for a man who had buried his love too soon. Later that morning, Eleanor joined Clara in the yard, helping her gather eggs from the henhouse. The little girl chattered happily about the chickens, about the way her papa always carried her on his shoulders to see over the corral fence, about how her mama used to sing to her. Eleanor listened, each word another thread weaving a picture of the woman who was no longer there. "Do you remember her songs?" Eleanor asked gently. Clara shook her head, curls bouncing. "No, but Papa says her hands were soft. He says when I miss her it means she mattered." Eleanor swallowed hard, blinking against the sting in her eyes. At supper that night, the air was thick with quiet. Samuel ate with his usual calm. Yet Eleanor noticed the way his eyes lingered on Clara when she laughed, the way his hand brushed the table near where his late wife's chair must have once been. When Eleanor rose to clear the dishes, she paused. "You carry her memory well," she said, her voice trembling slightly. Samuel looked up, his eyes dark as storm clouds. For a moment he seemed ready to answer, but then he only gave a small nod. That night, alone in the small spare room, Eleanor lay awake, listening to the prairie wind whisper against the shutters. She thought of the photograph, of Clara's innocent prayers, of the hollow space at the table that no one filled. She had stepped off the train at the wrong station, but already she was walking through a house full of ghosts. She closed her eyes, yet sleep came slow, her heart restless, stirred by whispers of the past that would not let her go. The days that followed passed in a hush that seemed to belong more to the house than to the land itself. Eleanor found her place in small tasks, sweeping the dust that crept in through the cracks, fetching water from the well when Clara grew tired of carrying the bucket, stirring the pot of beans that always seemed to be waiting at the hearth. Samuel said little, his voice heard mostly in short words to his daughter or in the steady rhythm of command when he worked the stock outside. He moved with purpose, his boots striking the earth like a man who carried burdens too heavy to set down. And though Eleanor tried to read his face, she found only stone. Clara filled the silence with her laughter and questions. She followed Eleanor like a shadow, asking her to braid ribbons into her curls, to tell stories from the city, to show her how to stitch a doll's dress from scraps of cloth. Eleanor answered with patience, her heart softening each time the child's small hand sought hers. Yet when evening fell and the house grew still, she felt the weight of Samuel's presence pressing against her own quiet. He was there, near but far, his silence not empty, but filled with something she could not yet name. One night, Eleanor found him mending a harness by the glow of a single lamp. His sleeves were rolled back, his forearms corded with muscle, his brow set in concentration. She hovered near the doorway, torn between offering help and retreating to the safety of her room. At last she said, "You work hard." The words felt clumsy, too small for the space between them. He looked up briefly, his eyes shadowed. "It is the only way to keep the land standing." Then he bent back to his task. The conversation ended as neatly as the stitch he tied. Eleanor stood for a moment longer, then turned away, the silence following her up the stairs. Her room, though plain, had become a place of comfort. She kept her small belongings folded carefully at the foot of her bed, her books stacked neatly on the dresser. Yet even there she was not free of the echoes that filled the house. At night, she heard Samuel's footsteps pacing across the floor below, the faint sound of him speaking low to his horse in the barn, the scrape of a chair pulled away from the table. It was a kind of company, though distant, and she found herself listening for it when sleep would not come. On the fourth evening, Clara curled against Eleanor's side by the fire, her eyes drooping as Eleanor read from a worn book. Samuel sat across from them, his chair angled toward the flames, his gaze fixed on the embers. Eleanor felt the moment stretch, the warmth of the child heavy against her shoulder, the silence of the man filling every corner. She closed the book softly and looked at him, waiting for him to meet her eyes. But he never did. That night, as she climbed the stairs with Clara's small hand still in hers, Eleanor knew the house carried two kinds of silence. One was the simple hush of the prairie, the stillness of wind and earth and sky. The other was the silence of a man who had once loved deeply and lost more than he could bear, a silence that held her at arm's length even as it drew her closer. She lay awake long after Clara's breathing steadied in the next room, her thoughts restless. She had come west searching for a promise written in ink, but what she had found instead was a quiet that pressed against her heart, a widow's silence that spoke louder than words ever could. The wind carried dust across the yard that morning, sweeping against the walls of the house until the boards rattled softly. Eleanor was kneeling in the small garden beside Clara, her skirts tucked under her as she plucked weeds between the rows of beans. Clara hummed a tune without words, her little hands busy patting down the earth around a crooked stalk that leaned too far to one side. The simple rhythm of the work gave Eleanor a strange peace, though her mind wandered often, circling the path that had brought her here. She had not planned to stay longer than a night, yet the days were slipping past quietly, and she found herself settling into their pattern without realizing it. The sound of hoofbeats broke the stillness. Eleanor looked up to see a rider coming from the road, his horse kicking up small clouds of red dust as it neared. Samuel stepped out from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag, his shoulders tense. The man dismounted with a creak of leather and handed Samuel a folded envelope, its edges worn from the ride. Words passed between them too low for Eleanor to hear. She rose slowly, brushing dirt from her hands, as Samuel turned the letter in his grasp and glanced toward her. For a moment, his eyes held something unreadable. Then he tucked the letter under his arm and walked toward the house. At supper that evening, the letter lay unopened on the mantel. Eleanor tried not to stare at it, though her gaze returned again and again. Samuel ate in silence, his spoon scraping against the tin bowl, while Clara told a story about chasing a hen that morning. Eleanor smiled at the girl, but her thoughts were restless. When the meal was done and Clara had gone to bed, she lingered by the table as Samuel poured coffee into 2 chipped mugs. At last she asked, her voice careful, "Is it bad news?" He looked up, his dark eyes steady. "It is a letter for you." Her breath caught. "For me?" Samuel reached for the envelope on the mantel and handed it across the table. Eleanor's fingers trembled as she broke the seal. The handwriting was familiar, a man's hand that had once written to her of clear skies and honest work, words that had carried her across the miles. She read quickly, her heart sinking with every line. He wrote that he had changed his mind, that her delay in arrival had been too long, that he had found another arrangement better suited to his needs. No apology, no kindness, only finality. Eleanor lowered the paper slowly, her throat tight. Samuel watched her quietly. "I am sorry," he said simply. She shook her head, forcing a small smile though her eyes burned. "I never even met him, and still I was not enough." She folded the letter and set it on the table with care, as though the act of touching it too harshly might break her already aching heart. The silence that followed was heavy but not cruel. Samuel's hands rested against the wood, scarred and strong. At last he spoke again, his voice rough but steady. "That man did not know you. He threw away more than he will ever understand." Eleanor looked at him, startled by the firmness in his tone. For a moment the room felt warmer, the quiet softer, as though something had shifted. Later, when she lay awake in her small room, Eleanor stared at the ceiling while Clara's even breathing carried faintly through the wall. The letter sat folded on the dresser, a stranger's rejection written in ink, yet in the space left by his absence, there was also a new thought that unsettled and comforted her both. Perhaps she had gotten off at the wrong station, but perhaps she had also stepped into the place she was meant to find all along. The morning sun rose pale and thin, spreading light across the Cooper ranch as if it were unsure of its welcome. Eleanor stood on the porch with a shawl draped around her shoulders, watching Clara chase a chicken through the yard, her laughter bright against the stillness of the land. The letter she had received the night before still lay folded in her room, its cruel words echoing in her chest. She had been cast aside without ever being known, yet here she was, woven quietly into the life of a child who clung to her with trust, and a man whose silence carried more weight than any stranger's rejection. Samuel came out of the barn with his hat pulled low, his sleeves rolled, and the smell of hay clinging to him. He paused when he saw her, his gaze lingering for a moment before he turned to gather tools from the wagon. Clara darted up to Eleanor, curls flying, breathless with excitement. "Mama," she said, tugging on her hand. "You have to come see the nest in the barn. There are 3 new eggs." The words slipped out so easily that Eleanor froze, her throat tightening. She looked down at the child's bright eyes and could not bring herself to correct her. Samuel glanced up at the sound, his expression unreadable, but he said nothing. That evening, Clara knelt beside her small bed, hands folded and eyes shut tight. Eleanor lingered at the doorway, her heart aching as she listened to the little girl's soft voice. "Dear God, thank you for sending Mama," Clara whispered. "I prayed so long, and now she is here. Please let her stay." Eleanor's breath caught, her hand pressing against her chest, as if to steady the storm inside. Samuel stood at the foot of the hall, his shadow long across the floor. He did not speak, but his head was bowed, and in the dim light she thought she saw his shoulders tremble once before he turned away. Later, as Eleanor tucked Clara beneath her quilt, the girl clutched her hand tightly. "You will not go, will you?" Clara asked, her eyes wide and fearful. Eleanor smoothed the curls from her forehead, forcing her voice steady. "Not tonight, sweetheart. Sleep now." Clara sighed, content, and drifted into dreams, still holding Eleanor's fingers until her grip loosened. Downstairs, the lamp flickered low, the flame bending in the draft that slipped beneath the door. Samuel sat at the table, his hands clasped, the lines of his face drawn deep. Eleanor hesitated before joining him, her steps soft on the worn boards. He did not lift his eyes at first, but when he did, there was something raw in them, something unguarded. "She prayed for you," he said at last, his voice quiet but steady. Eleanor folded her hands in her lap, her heart thudding painfully. "And what do you pray for, Mr. Cooper?" she asked. His mouth twitched as though the question cut deeper than she intended. "I stopped asking God for things a long time ago," he answered. But it seems he answered Clara too well. The silence that followed was thick with everything neither of them dared say. Eleanor lowered her gaze, her pulse quickening. She had come west, expecting a marriage to a stranger, a bargain struck in letters. Instead, she had stumbled into the prayers of a child, and the grief of a man who had not asked for her yet seemed unable to let her go. Upstairs, the little girl slept peacefully, certain that her prayers had been heard. Downstairs, 2 souls sat across from one another, wondering if those prayers had written a story they were not ready to speak aloud. The heat of late afternoon clung to the land when the sound of carriage wheels broke the quiet at the Cooper Ranch. Eleanor was at the garden with Clara, pulling weeds from between rows of beans, when Clara looked up and shaded her eyes with one small hand. A dark buggy rolled up the path, drawn by 2 chestnut horses, their polished coats gleaming in the Sunday dust, swirled behind the wheels as the rig came to a halt near the porch. Eleanor rose slowly, brushing the dirt from her skirt, a ripple of unease twisting through her chest. The door of the carriage opened with a sharp creak, and a woman stepped down, tall and elegant, dressed in a plum traveling coat, with gloves so spotless they seemed untouched by the road. Her hat was trimmed with lace and feathers, her chin lifted as though she were stepping into a grand hall instead of a patched farmhouse in the middle of New Mexico territory. Her eyes swept across the house, the yard, and then settled on Eleanor with a look that was neither kind nor curious, but dismissive. "Randall Cooper," she said briskly, her voice clipped with polish. Samuel had just stepped out of the barn, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. His shoulders stiffened when he saw her. "Eleanor Hargrove," he muttered, his tone flat. "I did not send for you." The woman's lips curved into a thin smile. "No, you did not. But your sister wrote to me. She said you were too proud to ask for help, too stubborn to do what is proper. She insisted you needed a wife, a mother for your child, a woman who knows how to manage a house as it should be run." She glanced pointedly at Eleanor, her eyebrow arching. "I see she may have been right." Clara slipped behind Eleanor, clutching the fabric of her skirt. Eleanor rested a steadying hand on the girl's shoulder, her heart pounding though she kept her chin lifted. Samuel stepped forward, his jaw tight. "This is my house, Eleanor. I make my own choices." The woman ignored him, moving closer with deliberate steps. "You cannot mean to settle for this," she said, her gaze cutting toward Eleanor like a blade. A stray who stepped off the train at the wrong station. What sort of example does that set for your daughter? Eleanor's cheeks burned, though she refused to lower her eyes. Clara's grip on her tightened, and she bent her head to whisper softly, "It is all right, sweetheart." Samuel's hand twitched at his side, his silence sharp as a knife. At last he spoke, his voice low but carrying. "You will not speak to her that way." The woman blinked, startled, then scoffed. "Randall, be sensible. You need a woman of standing. This," she gestured toward Eleanor with a gloved hand, "is temporary." Eleanor's heart twisted at the word. Yet she stood still, her back straight, refusing to let the insult hollow her. Samuel's eyes hardened. "She is not temporary. She is my guest, and she is part of this home as long as she chooses to stay." The air between them thickened, the prairie wind stilling as though the land itself listened. Eleanor felt Clara's small hand in hers, felt the steadiness in Samuel's words settle something inside her that had trembled for too long. She met Eleanor Hargrove's sharp gaze, not with anger but with quiet strength, and in that moment she knew she was not the woman who had stepped off the train, lost and uncertain. She was someone being chosen, not cast aside. The rival's arrival had brought more dust than grace to the Cooper Ranch, but as the sun dipped low, Eleanor realized it had also drawn a line clear as any fence post. Samuel had spoken not only for her but beside her, and Clara had pressed herself close as if she already knew the truth. The door may have opened to a rival, but what it revealed was something stronger than pride or propriety, the fragile beginnings of a family that had already taken root. The night fell heavy over the Cooper Ranch, the air thick with heat that refused to loosen its grip. Eleanor moved quietly through the small house, her skirts brushing the worn floorboards, her thoughts restless from the harsh words that had been spoken earlier. She had seen the way Eleanor Hargrove looked at her, sharp and cold, as though she were nothing but a mistake clinging to a life she did not deserve. Those words gnawed at her, even as she tried to steady her heart. She had told herself she was stronger now, but when the house grew still, doubt had a way of seeping in. Clara's soft voice broke the silence. Eleanor paused outside the child's room, hearing the faint sound of whimpering. She pushed the door open slowly and found Clara curled beneath the quilt, her small face flushed red, her curls damp against her temples. "Sweetheart," Eleanor whispered, hurrying to her side. She laid the back of her hand against the child's brow and felt the fire of fever burning hot through her skin. Clara stirred, murmuring something about her mama, and clutched weakly at Eleanor's sleeve. Samuel appeared in the doorway a moment later, his frame filling the space, his eyes narrowing when he saw the girl. He crossed the room in 2 strides, kneeling at the bedside, his rough hand brushing against Clara's cheek. The sight of his strong fingers trembling against her skin made Eleanor's throat tighten. "She has a fever," Eleanor said, her voice low but steady. "We need cool water. Now." Samuel nodded once, already moving to fetch a basin. Eleanor stayed with Clara, wiping her brow with the hem of her apron, murmuring soft words though she was not sure if the girl could hear. Memories pressed against her of her own younger sister, taken by sickness years ago, her cries in the night unanswered, by a father too drunk to care. She pushed the thought away, focusing on the child before her, determined that Clara would not suffer the same fate. Samuel returned with water and a cloth, his movements quick and sure, though his face was pale. Together they worked through the long hours, bathing Clara's temples, coaxing her to sip when her lips were dry, whispering encouragement when her body shivered. At one point, Clara stirred, her eyes barely open, and whispered, "Mama, don't go." Eleanor pressed a kiss to her damp curls, her heart breaking at the plea. "I am here, Clara," she whispered. "I will not go." Samuel's eyes met hers across the bed, the lamplight catching in his dark gaze. Something unspoken passed between them, a raw and desperate bond, forged not in words, but in the shared fight to keep the child breathing steady. For the first time, Eleanor saw the cracks in his silence, the fear etched deep into him, the fear of losing more than he could bear. The fever raged until near dawn, When at last Clara's body relaxed, her breaths deepening, her skin cooling beneath their hands, Eleanor slumped against the side of the bed, exhaustion pulling at her limbs, but relief flooding her chest. Samuel remained kneeling, his hand still resting on his daughter's, his shoulders sagging, as though the weight of the night had pressed him nearly to the ground. When the sun broke over the horizon, weak and pale, Eleanor rose stiffly and pulled a blanket around her shoulders. Samuel looked up at her then, his face lined with weariness, but his eyes softer than she had ever seen. "She prayed for you," he said quietly, his voice rough with fatigue. Eleanor's throat closed, tears threatening, but she forced a small smile. Then maybe her prayers were answered after all. The house was quiet once more, but it was no longer the silence of strangers. It was the hush of a family who had weathered the night together, clinging to hope when fear tried to break them. Eleanor sat near the bed, watching Clara's chest rise and fall, and knew that even if she had arrived at the wrong station, she was exactly where she was meant to be. The afternoon sun slanted low over Dust Creek, throwing long shadows across the wooden platform where the train tracks cut a sharp line through the town. Eleanor stood at the edge with her small case in hand, her heart pounding louder than the rumble of iron wheels in the distance. The letter she had received days earlier had shattered what little certainty she carried, telling her that the man she had been meant to marry no longer wanted her, that her long journey west had been nothing but wasted time. She had told herself she would leave quietly, slip away before dawn, without burdening anyone further. Yet when the time came, she found herself hesitating, her feet rooted to the planks as though the earth itself refused to let her go. Clara's scarf was tucked carefully in her case, half finished, the stitches crooked but made with a child's love. Eleanor had tried not to look at it as she packed, but her eyes returned again and again to the uneven threads, to the tiny hands that had worked them. She had whispered a goodbye over the sleeping girl's curls, her throat tight, and slipped from the house with a weight in her chest heavier than any suitcase. Now, as the train whistled in the distance, she pressed a hand to her middle to steady the ache. The platform was nearly empty, save for a ranch hand or two waiting with crates of supplies. She told herself it was better this way. No tears, no words, only the clean break of steel wheels carrying her far from what could never be hers. Yet when the sound of boots striking the planks carried across the station, she turned. Samuel was there, his broad shoulders tense, his hat pushed low as if he had ridden harder than sense allowed. Dust clung to his boots, his shirt dark with sweat, but his eyes were fixed only on her. He came to a stop a few feet away, his breath heavy, his chest rising and falling as though the words he carried weighed more than the ride itself. "You were just going to leave," he said, his voice rough. Eleanor's grip tightened on the case handle. "It seemed best," she answered quietly. "You did not ask for me, Mr. Cooper. I came by mistake, and your sister made clear I do not belong here." Samuel shook his head, stepping closer, his voice low but steady. "You were not a mistake. You are the only thing that has felt right in a long time." His words struck her harder than she expected, and she looked away, blinking against the sting in her eyes. "Your daughter prayed for me," she whispered. "But I am not her mother, Samuel, and I fear I never could be." "She already calls you Mama," he said, his voice breaking on the word. "And she sleeps easier with you here than she ever has since Lily passed. That is not something I can turn from. Not anymore." He reached into his coat and pulled out the little scarf, the one Clara had worked so hard to finish. The stitches were uneven, but his hand trembled as though it were a treasure. "She made this for you, Eleanor. She has not let it out of her sight since you left the house, and I have not either." The whistle blew again, sharper this time, the train looming into view. Eleanor's chest ached, her feet frozen between the steps she thought she must take and the truth spilling from the man before her. Samuel's eyes found hers, dark and unflinching. "I cannot promise you riches or ease," he said, his voice firm, despite the rawness in it. "But I can promise you this. You will never again be treated as a bargain struck or a mistake to be sent away. You will be a choice, and you will be mine if you want to be." The train slowed, steam hissing, voices calling out from its cars. Eleanor stared at it for one long breath, the road back east opening wide before her, safe, familiar, empty. Then she looked at Samuel, his hand still holding the scarf, his face unguarded for the first time since she had met him. She let the case slip from her grasp, the sound of it striking the wood sharp as a shot. Her steps carried her forward until she stood close enough to see the dust caught in his lashes. "I do not want to go," she whispered, the words tumbling out before she could think to stop them. Relief flickered across his face, raw and unshaped, and in that moment the whistle faded, the platform fell away, and the only sound that mattered was the breath they both shared in the space between them. The morning light spilled soft and golden across Dust Creek, warming the boards of the Cooper porch and painting the dry grass with a glow that made the land look almost forgiving. Eleanor stood at the rail, her hands wrapped loosely around a chipped mug of coffee, her eyes drawn to the yard where Clara was running barefoot through the dust. The child's laughter carried high and bright, her curls bouncing as she clutched a ragged doll against her chest. Samuel leaned against the post beside Eleanor, his arms crossed, his gaze steady on his daughter, though now and then his eyes slid toward Eleanor as if to be sure she was still there. The house felt different since the night of Clara's fever, different since the moment on the platform when Eleanor let her suitcase fall and chose to stay. The air no longer carried the sharp edges of silence. It was warmer now, filled with the sound of small footsteps, the hum of Eleanor's voice when she read aloud, the quiet rhythm of Samuel's laugh when Clara said something only a child could say. Eleanor still felt a catch in her chest when she thought of how near she had come to leaving, how easily she might have been gone by now, her name forgotten, and her presence nothing but a mistake. Instead, she was here, with a girl who called her Mama without hesitation, and a man whose quiet steadiness spoke louder than words ever could. She set the mug down and stepped off the porch, her skirt brushing against her boots as she walked toward Clara. The little girl flung herself into her arms without pause, her small body warm and solid against her. "Mama?" she said breathlessly. "Papa fixed the fence this morning, but I think it is still leaning." Eleanor laughed softly and kissed her hair. "Then maybe you and I will have to help him later." Clara nodded seriously, as though it were the most natural thing in the world for them to share the work. Samuel came to join them, his stride slow, his shadow falling long across the ground. He crouched beside them, resting a calloused hand against Clara's back. For a moment they stayed like that, the three of them pressed close, and Eleanor felt the quiet strength of it settle deep in her bones. She had never known such belonging, never felt so firmly rooted in a place she had not chosen yet had chosen her all the same. Later that afternoon, Eleanor baked bread while Samuel mended a broken chair at the table. Clara perched beside him, with her scarf project still in her lap. The house smelled of yeast and wood smoke, of earth and life and the promise of supper. The walls were patched, the furniture worn, the roof still leaked in one corner when it rained. Yet to Eleanor it was finer than any house she had ever known. Every board, every nail seemed to hold a memory already, the sound of laughter, the echo of a prayer answered in a way none of them had expected. When the day gave way to evening, they sat on the porch together, watching the sun sink low over the horizon. Samuel's arm brushed against Eleanor's, not claiming, not pressing, simply there, steady and sure. Clara leaned against her lap, already half asleep, her small hand curled tightly around Eleanor's fingers. Eleanor looked out at the land, wide and rough and still scarred by drought, and felt no fear. She was not a woman lost at the wrong station anymore. She was not a mistake to be cast aside, nor a bargain struck by desperate hands. She was part of something, chosen and choosing, bound not by paper, but by love, that had grown quietly in the cracks of brokenness. As the stars began to scatter across the sky, she let her head rest lightly against Samuel's shoulder. He did not speak, but she felt his hand shift, covering hers with a warmth that needed no words. And in that moment, with the girl between them, and the night folding gently around their home, Eleanor knew she had found what she had never dared to hope for. She had found a family at last. The morning in Dust Creek broke clear and soft, the sky painted with streaks of rose and gold, the air still cool before the heat of the day pressed down. Eleanor stood by the old oak tree at the edge of the Cooperland, her hand smoothing the skirt of her plain dress. It was not silk or lace, not the sort of gown her mother once dreamed she would wear, but it was hers. Clara darted around her in the grass, scattering wildflower petals from a basket she clutched proudly, her laughter ringing like church bells. Samuel stood a few steps away, his hat in his hand, his broad shoulders squared, his eyes fixed on Eleanor with a quiet steadiness that made her heart catch. There was no preacher that morning, no chapel filled with whispers, no town gathered to watch. Just the three of them under the oak that had stood longer than memory, its branches wide enough to shelter them and their promises. Samuel took Eleanor's hands, rough and scarred, yet gentle as he held her. His voice was low, roughened by years of silence, yet steady with the weight of truth. "You were not supposed to be here," he said, his thumb brushing across her knuckles. "You stepped off the train too soon, got caught in the wrong place, and somehow ended up in my life. And I thank God every day that you did." Eleanor's eyes shimmered, her throat tight, as she answered, "I thought I was lost. I thought I had been forgotten, sent west to a man who no longer wanted me. But when I stepped onto that platform, and Clara called me Mama, something inside me shifted. I thought it was a mistake, but now I know it was Providence." She squeezed his hands, her voice growing stronger. "I do not want fine rooms or polished lives. I want this. I want you, Samuel Cooper, and this land, and this little girl who prayed for me." Clara stopped scattering petals long enough to grin at them, her curls bouncing in the morning light. "Then say it, Mama," she urged. "Say you do." Eleanor laughed through her tears and looked back at Samuel, the weight of her choice both fierce and freeing. "I do," she whispered. Samuel's jaw tightened, as though holding back a flood, but his voice was steady as he answered, "So do I." He pulled her close then, pressing his forehead gently to hers, and the world seemed to hush around them, the leaves rustling above as though in blessing. Clara clapped her small hands and spun in the grass, shouting, "We are a family now." The rest of the day was filled with small things that felt like miracles. Bread broken at the table, Samuel's low laugh as Clara told a crooked story about her doll, Eleanor humming as she sewed a patch on his sleeve, her head resting later against his shoulder as the fire crackled low. They did not need witnesses or documents. Their vows were stitched into every breath, every step, every glance that carried more than words ever could. As the stars came out, Eleanor thought back to the train platform, to the moment she thought she had made a wrong turn that would ruin her life. She smiled softly as she leaned closer to Samuel. She had stepped off too soon, but perhaps some journeys were not meant to follow maps. Perhaps the heart knew where to go long before the feet did. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to Western Love Legends. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. There are so many more tales of love and grit waiting on the frontier. Stories where the heart always finds a way home. And remember, sometimes stepping off at the wrong station is the only way to end up in the right place, though you might just lose your suitcase to a chicken on the way.